Thank you to Haesong, and thank you for the introduction, and for all of you and your presence here tonight. Thanks to Chadron State College. I hope I pronounced that right. When I came here, I was like kind of self-conscious. I was like, is it Chadron? But people were saying Chadron, and so thank you all for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. And it was really wonderful to, be here in the community and to visit Haesong students, creative writing students. Everybody was very welcoming and nice, and so I really appreciate it. And so far, I got here on Monday, and it's been a good time. So it's a really nice town you have here. So. She'e Orlando White da shijine Naaneesht'e tchaba Naakai Dine bashichin tchachini da shiche aro kiaani da shinale total kande yisi dena sha gut out and then the My name is Orlando White, and my clans are the Zuni Water Edge people. Born for the Mexican clan. My maternal grandparents are the Red Streak Running Through Water people, and my paternal grandparents are Towering House people. I'm originally from a place called Sweetwater, located on Dine Nation, in the Four Corners region of what we would call the so-called state of Arizona. So I'm going to read a few things tonight. I'm going to start with a really short essay and then move into some poetry from my first book and my second book, and then into some newer work. The title of this is Functional White, Crafting Space and Silence. The white space is just as important as the text in a poem, whether it's the counter that shapes an O or S, a line break after a word, or a caesura within a line. With space, one can shape sound and language to create a poetic field. And with that, one may express a silence. When we write or type, our focus seems to be on a small percentage of the paper, which is where the text is placed. But around it, there lies a pause, a momentary rest that hibernates. Much like a semi-brief rest within a measure, or like a crease pattern after unfolding a sheet of paper, space holds rhythm and structure. Plus, what are letters, words, punctuation, and sentences without the music and form of the page? A particular text that comes to mind is Lecture on Nothing by John Cage, in which he composes measures of white space. In his introduction to the lecture, he emphasizes how to read the text by saying, "This should not be done in an artificial manner, which might result from an attempt to be too strictly faithful to the position of the words on the page, but with the rubato which one uses in everyday speech." In a way, Cage reminds us not to depend on language, but rather to consider the cadence of line in relation to the page's expanse, where the paper and body and ink and breath exist simultaneously in order to create a literary moment for the writer. That connection between poet and page becomes proportional to each other, where symmetry occurs in that instant you ascend, then descend, and finally crossbar the A, the letter A. Your hand is the letter along with your body, synchronizing with ink and vice versa, because there is a pulse in the human figure. There is pulse within the folio as well. The poetic existence and space between the written language is a vital sign of silence. Designers of publications refer to the white spaces of the page as functional white. Functional white guides the reader through a text. White space allows text to exist in a specific position on the page in relation to the background. And perhaps that background is the throat of paper, inhaling language and exhaling sound and silence, like Inuit throat singers. When the page and poet are face to face, close enough for both their lips to meet, their breaths subsist off each other. And in an instant, that natural, ornate experience blends person and page. The line and its breath, with its origin from the lung of the page, is caesuric, as poets are too, because pauses construct the spaces which interweave letters, words, and thoughts on a sheet of paper. Though silence on the page develops habitually from our use of techniques as poetry writers, sometimes being aware of the white spaces rather than concerning ourselves with punctuation and language allows us to experience the silence personally. Perhaps text sometimes acts as a polarizing filter that darkens the paper and dims the brightness of the page. So it's up to us to write and unwrite and interpret and reinterpret the page through space by making language and silence collaborate. Because there is another rhythm waiting to reawaken from the depths of the page. And we should construe and create the pause before and during the reading and writing of a poem. This is just a little excerpt from a lecture on nothing by John Cage. Visually, I just really enjoy this because I like the spacing between the words and the punctuation marks. And if you know John Cage, you know, he likes to really do interesting things with sound and silence on the page as well. So I'm going to read from my first book, which is titled Bone Light. This is titled Analogy. I. This is the lowercase I. I. On the page, a man the size of a letter wears a white necktie and a dark suit. J. Next to him, a woman the size of a letter too. She wears a white scarf and a black gown. Hyphen. Not a punctuation sign, but a mark of accentuation written between two lovers. I, J. He says, I am a single bone under the skin of a letter. She says, I too am a letter, but I have a curved hip bone. I-J. See them on the white bed of a page, how they hyphenate, how they will create language together. I've always, I don't know if I call it fantasize, or maybe imagining 2 letters from the alphabet, you know, having sex on the page. Lowercase I and J. Man with 1 leg. No arms. Wears black suit. White necktie. Woman in black dress. White scarf. No arms too. On white sheet, both attend paper funeral. Tears, ink, but you can put a hyphen between them. Look, they are holding hands. I without J. A punctuation soaks through white. Press, ear, onto blank, paper, sound, of space between letters. Dot without I, period, without sentence. Let ink shape the hyphen instead of a period. Listen. It will appear on the page. I next to J. Using a white eraser, he wipes the ink off his face and says, I am a zero. He does not want to look like a dark skeleton with a white skull. To be a letter means to be stuck on paper. Instead, he will unzip out of the black suit he wears and throw it off the page. Even though he still feels detached from his body, he will rotate his head to the left, speak into the ear of the letter J, and say, why am I a letter taken for a number when capitalized? I, J. Skeletons shaped like two letters. She holds a comma. He holds a black dot. Each do not know the other until they are laid next to one another. Underneath the paper, both have faces. If you look under the page, you will see two lovers shaped like I and J, kissing with a hyphen. So I had, in the early part of, when I was exploring my imagination as a poetry writer, I became obsessed with these two letters from the alphabet, which is I and J. And, I always look at letters in my mind, they are people. And I was mentioning this to some of Haesong's students that I am a person and you are a person. Per meaning single, one. S-O-N, son is the root of sound. So this idea of, right, that we are one sound, we are sound moving. And I think it's the same with individual letters from the alphabet. You know, they are sound. You know, sound moves through them. But I also just like the image of them, because I was also explaining to some of Haesong's students when I first thought of writing these I and J poems. If you look at the bathroom symbols for the male and female, you know, their bodies are separated, the head is separated from the body. So when I look at the male symbol, the bathroom symbol for the male, I saw the lowercase I. And then when I saw the bathroom symbol for women, I saw the lowercase j. So the little curve there like reminds me of like a dress. So she's wearing a black dress and he's wearing a black suit. Oh. And then the white space in between the dot and the body is, you know, he's wearing a white necktie and she's wearing a white scarf. So I know it sounds silly, but so I'm going to move to my second book, which is titled Letters. And so I'll read a couple here and then I'll move into some new work and then we'll finish from there. Emit. Letters will evade and strive within the labor of words, under the weight of ink, of languish, and each alphabet a stay-piece, a lilt of sound, curve murmurs to O, and straight quivers an L. In that moment, form intones, letters exist in book. The cochlea of thought, an impulse shudders J, its bent leg leaps out from a sentence as I stridulates its serif points against paper, a deep, trill, silent chirp. Limb. It reveals the sketch of letters from meditation, of an I, a pause between line and dot, or length of the curve in J, space, and stroke determine the ductus of letter. And when a circle in thought functions only as an idea, notarized into paper, it becomes a gradation of pigments, an absent measure of thought, an outline of the color white. Etymon. Sketch the outer edge of a sound's visible stem and dot where vowel space modifies tongue's closing gesture, a variant from the open swash of J. Adjacent to each, linked with italic strokes to ease handwriting and print, only later scissioned to distinguish context and phonetics. He, for the first time, suggests a thought puzzle, imaginary, to root in form of negative sooth, sense. Yet, in self-argument, he encases his pitch in print, subjects his prefigure to unlimit meaning, and prescribes a fixity in formula and folio, manifests his body as pronoun, dense like ink, and tittle, idle as period. I'm gonna end with this one here. It's titled Cephalic. I place a black cloth the size of a dot over his head, wrap his entire minuscule body with a thread of my black hair. He lies there on a white sheet of paper and squirms like a dark cocoon, thinks he is going to transform. The letter, when it begins to lose color in a book never opened, becomes a macula in thought. And when read through the lens of a decimal point, see its dark fleck of a cranium, see expendable language. Grab the letter J next to him, hold it like a tiny black scythe, behead the I, and watch its dot head roll to the back of a sentence. So I'm gonna transition to some new work that I've been working on. One-word poems. I know that sounds silly, but I think that's the beauty of language. And being a poetry writer and taking that kind of risk with imagination, you know, the possibilities I think are pretty endless. Poetry is about the word itself, and, you know, the word itself is also very much alive, much like the lowercase I and J. So I'll share a few one-word poems, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. Wa, to, ish, 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 hash, ish, ish. Sadla, adla, adla, dla. Bloodil. Ha, za. azdi. Aden. Nazbas nanamas, nazbas nanamas, nazbas nanamas, nazbas nanamas, nazbas nanamas. Hojan, Hochon, Hochon, Hojan. Naltos. Diyoge. Che. Honte. Thank you. Yeah, it's working. So yeah, this is a one-word poem in which I took two Dine words, so two Navajo words, and conjoined them. And so they have an intersection, which is the letter O. So Hojan, this one Hojan, has ends with the O, and then Hochon ends with an O. So, you know, that O sort of, you know, creates this intersection between the two words. But I kept Hojan upward, and then Hochon upside down. So the notion of duality plays a big part. Philosophically, in Dine culture, those are some of the things that we think about that take place in prayer, that take place in ceremony, that take place within our home, that take place within our mind, but also take place in how we speak, right? So it's really the philosophy of, here I translate it as positive, hojo, and hochon as negative. So, you know, there always has to be that balance between the two. So, it's, without bad, good wouldn't exist, and vice versa. So philosophically, that's part of how Dine folks, how we approach in terms of our sort of outlook on life and our self, our relationship to, the land, the cosmos, and things like that. And so we can kind of think of it as the, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, the yin and yang, right? You've seen that sort of symbol. So there's that, it very much sort of has that same kind of energy of balance. In Buddhist thought, they have that kind of thinking as well. So for Dine folks, philosophically, but also spiritually, it's a really big part of who we are in terms of how we exist. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, so most of the one-word poems, as you saw, are all in Dine. Unfortunately, we don't have our own syllabary, like the Cherokee, for example. So our alphabet is based off of the Western construct of the English alphabet. So, but one thing about our language is that we have a lot of diacritical marks, which make it interesting visually on the page. So we have a lot of high tones. So the high tones that go above the letter, as you see the O. We also have a lot of nasal tones in our language, and that's the symbol, the nasal. It looks like a comma that's underneath the O there. So it's a nasal sound. So when you say hojan, jean, and then you feel, the inside of your nose vibrate a little. So we have a lot of nasal tones in our language, but we also have a lot of diacritical marks. We only have 4 vowel sounds. We don't have any U sounds in our language, but I believe we have about, I think like 40 different vowel sounds in our language, somewhere around there. But also, I want to come back to this, just to sort of, what is known as an apostrophe is an actual letter. It's an actual sound in our language. So here I have the word haza, which means as space or space. So I isolated the apostrophe, and that's known as a glottal stop, right, in our language. So a glottal stop acts as a moment of pause, right? So we can think of it as like maybe how a comma or a semicolon functions in a sentence, right? It creates a sort of pause. So, but it's an actual sound, and the sound is just silence. It's quiet. So the apostrophe or the glottal stop is a part of our alphabet. So it's kind of interesting to think about. Because in my mind, when I think of sound, I think of diacritical marks. So like if you were to, write in a different language and remove the letter form and just leave, the diacritical marks, it creates this, it's like a beautiful sort of musical score, And I think, when it comes to written language, diacritical marks are really central to the existence of language. And in Dine culture, we think that the origin of language is sound, right? So, and I think it's like that, probably in a lot of cultures, right? This idea that the origin of language is sound, right? So it's it's like we are sound as well, So where sound is energy, and it's a constant movement. So we are, I think, as we're like a physical presence of sound, I think, in terms of being a person. So I hope that answers your question. When I was an undergraduate, I was studying creative writing at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, also known as IAIA. And when I was there, I read a manifesto by a guy named Charles Olson, and he was part of the Black Mountain movement, which was this arts movement. And he wrote this manifesto it was titled, composition by field, or what was the other word for it? Projective verse. So projective verse was this idea that Olson, along with Robert Creeley, came up with this organic way of approaching writing poems. So we have to understand, so this was like taking place like in the 40s. Up until that time, in terms of American poetry, a lot of poetry being written were fixed forms, like sonnets and villanelles, etc. And so, you had people like Theodore Rothke, you had poets who were, so then, what was known as academic poetry. So the academic poetry movement, I guess you could say their whole thing was that the origin of line is meter. So that's what the academic poets thought. But then Black Mountain poets like Charles Olson came along. He wrote projective verse, and he was basically saying that the origin of line is breath, right? So that's what influenced me a lot when I read Olson's poems. And I've heard him read one time on a YouTube video, and the way he was reading was really beautiful, but in my mind I was trying to figure out where the breath is on the page. So for me, that was the white spacing. So a lot of my poetry has a lot of white spaces in between words and lines. So I always say respect the Sejoura, not in that traditional sense, but in a sense that I think that when you have a relationship with what you're creating on the page, the page is also participating as well, right? So you also want to kind of honor that, I think. So whenever I read, that's the spacing on the page I'm honoring. So when I read it live, it's the pauses and the silence that sort of is invoked, right, during the reading. So, it's really, and it really started with projective verse by Charles Olson. And then, of course, I discovered another wonderful writer named Edmond Jabez, and he wrote a book called The Book of Questions. And, he talks about the idea of how, the book is the body, right? That when the page is turned, right, your body is also turning in some way. And, just a lot of interesting writers like that. And I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Yeah, I think, also projective verse, part of it was also like looking at the page as a musical score. So instead of just focusing on one part of the page and writing your poem there, spread your words and your language out all across the page like a musical score, right? Because, so yeah, that's basically where I started reading. Some people find it, sometimes in the past, especially when my first book came out, I used to get hecklers a lot because of the silence. Yeah. Like, I remember one reading, I was reading and I had the pauses and the silence and stuff. And then someone in the back was just like, it was funny. I had one time I was reading and a woman, she started ripping paper out of her notebook and crumpling it. She was in the front row. So yeah, sometimes they'll get hecklers. Or they'll come up to me after the reading and they're like, why are you reading like that? Like, some of them will come up, like I've had a few people at my readings, they come up to me afterwards and like, that was very uncomfortable. That was just so uncomfortable for me. I just want you to know that. I'm like, okay. I've had different types of hecklers. It's funny, but the pauses and the silence really is also from the page itself. So, if you read some of my work, I have the poems like scattered all over, with a lot of spacing in between. Same in my second book. So, that's just how, for me, the act of participating with what you create to create that balance between like myself being a poetry writer and my relationship to the page and to the language I'm using. I feel like there needs to be a balance between that. Also, Projectiverse says too, Olson talks about energy. So he says that the energy of the poet goes onto the page when they write the poem. That energy transfers from the poet to the page, and then the energy transfers from the page to the reader or the listener. And so, so that energy obviously could be breath, right? So for me, I try to exercise that in my process as an artist, by doing, invoking silence. So I see it sort of as a meditation as well, So when I'm up here and I'm reading it, it feels, like I'm meditating, Even though they're my own words, I still learn a lot. Some of these poems I haven't read in a while, like the I and J stuff. So, so the I and J, they're, I guess you could say they're kind of good friends of mine at this point. So, really, it's if we go to this poem, like this one here. This is this. Basically, a one-word poem also is concrete visual poetry, right? Taking a single word and creating a visual pattern for it, right, on the page. It could also be minimal poetry, right? So in Haesong's class, we looked at some of those one-word poems. We looked at B.P. Nickel, who's a wonderful writer. He has like some really fun, kind of quirky one-word poems. Like he has the word empty on the page, but he removes the P. And so there's a space in between it. He does silly things like the word grow, but he adds just one more W at the end. And then there's Aram Sarayan, who's this Armenian writer. He has a book called The Complete Minimal Poems. Really, I recommend that book. He does minimal poems in there. There's a misspelling, a deliberate misspelling of the word light, in which he adds an extra GH in between the word. And I was telling students that he won a poetry award like back in the 60s, and everybody was like, is that a poem, right? Is it really a poem? And, like in the case of the one-word poems, and these one-word poems are in my language, and Dine language, so, and if there was a Dine person here, like, if they're fluent in the language, and, like it just sort of opens their mind, like, whoa, like, it's interesting. So, yeah, for me, it's really about the words. So that's what really poetry is about. It's just about the words themselves. So for me, that's what poetry is. It's the words themselves. And, how do we approach it in such a way that, we can, basically just create a relationship with it. And, I believe in risk, in particular imaginative risk, as a writer, as an artist. And so It's okay if you write something and it only makes sense in your mind, in your head, and nobody else gets it. I think you're going in the right direction with your own art. So I think for me, poetry has always been about the words themselves, really. I'm also like into the fundamental idea of poetry. When I was a grad student at Brown University, one of the things our poetry workshop professor would do is he would take us to different departments at the university. And one time we visited the physics department, and this was the first time that scientists, physicists who were teaching at Brown had isolated an electron and made it into a movie. And so they were able to, I guess you could say, implode an electron, so you can see an electron with the human eye, and it was filmed. And it was so funny. I remember we were sitting, and he was like really excited for us to like see this electron, and the movie was only like 5 seconds. But and it was so funny how they edited it. Remember the movie with the lion when it roars at the beginning of a movie? Yeah, like that came on, and then basically like 4 seconds of an electron. But how I understood it was what they did was they sort of boxed it inside. So I think it was like in like a box, but it was a transparent box, but it was filled with water. And they had different elements that would go off all at the same time. They had an element of light, and then an element of sound. And there were some other things that I'm not a scientist or anything like that, but what I noticed was that it was because electrons are in everything, right? So, so it was inside this box, right? And to me, I saw that as the page. I mean, when you looked at the box, it was just transparent. It was water. You couldn't see. There was just nothing there. It was like nothing was appearing, right? But they had the element of light, a light source, which for me is imagery, poetic image. And then the source of sound, they had a speaker, and the speaker creates sound, right? And sound is an important element in poetry as well. And so when they're both used simultaneously, the electron would appear like almost like an orb. But what was interesting though was every time they flashed it, the electron would act in certain ways, like it would go zigzaggy or make a curve or just go straight down. So it would do all these wonderful patterns. So for me, that was really to me, that's how I see language. That's how I see poetry. So I think, when you're writing a poem and things like, literary devices like metaphor, right? Or literary devices like anaphora, sound, image, right? When you bring them together, it appears on the page, right? Those words, the language, start to appear on the page. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but I didn't, and that was the cool thing, thinking about poetry for me, has always been about words themselves, really. It's the intuitive moment. And people think that I practice in front of a mirror or something or time myself, but I don't. Usually it's in the moment when it happens. So there's something organic about that, which again is my influence from projective verse, right? That, to sort of invoke silence in that moment. And so the audience is not the only person participating in that moment. I am as well, even though it's happening intuitively. Sometimes when an audience irritates me, I'll use longer pauses. Which I have done. I read one time, and the audience they just weren't vibing with me. There was a poet that went before me, and and they were just like so into his poetry. And then I came up after, and they just weren't like, I could feel it. The audience was just not vibing with me. And so then to irritate them, I had my pauses, I would go longer. I know I don't know if that sounds mean, but I know it's just. Actually, I don't use any fancy program software. Actually, I created all of these on Microsoft Word. Nice. Yeah. So yeah. I like the idea of, it's, I guess you could say I'm kind of a minimalist in that it's not how much you put into it, it's how much you leave out, right? And I think writing these one-word poems in my tribal language, in my tribe's language, for me, the process is also meditative because I feel like I'm connecting to the sounds of the word, right? And also having that relationship visually with it. So in Microsoft Word, there are ways in which you can manipulate text, right? So you can do that through, like inserting a text box, right? And then typing a word in there. So that's how I was able to stack like these words here, is just using the text box, right? The font I'm using primarily is this one, is called Carrara text. So it's almost kind of similar to Helvetica, right? In that there's less noise in the font, meaning that Carrara font typeface is a little bit more clearer, so you can see it very clearly. But I also use, for the diacritical marks, I use Times New Roman Navajo font. So I use those two fonts primarily right now, and and I use Microsoft Word to sort of build these poems, these one-word poems in my language. And so, yeah, like this one, and what I like about this one too is to is our word for language, or for water. So, so I took the word water in terms of its IPA, right? Not the drink, but from the dictionary. And so above the A, you have diaereses, right? The two dots. And then you have the upside down E in reverse, which is the schwa, right? And so these all create short vowel sounds, right? In terms of linguistics. But visually, like the diacritical, the schwa, and the diaereses, and then you have the high tone above the O, makes it visually sort of, beautiful. Ish, 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 this is the sound. So our word for mud is hushed ish. So I'm paying attention to the sound here, right? Because when you step in mud, it makes that sound, ish, right? So a lot of our words in Dine are onomatopoeic, right? Onomatopoeia. This one was playful. I took the word for language, sod, and then a verb, adla, is drinking. So this is about the sound as well. So when we say adla, if you listen to someone drink water, you hear that sound, right? When people drinking water. So the word adla, right? It's making that sound when someone's drinking. This one is blood dish. So our word for blood is dish. But I also took the upside down V, which is, the upside down V is an O sound, like OH, O sound. So when you say the word blood, right? Blood, there's that O sound. But visually, I just thought, it looked really cool. Plus, I have the D's in blood and dish sort of overlapping each other. So, because, in print, right? Like when a text or an image bleeds, right? It bleeds like layers onto the back, or or on top of each other or whatever. So, so yeah, this is all of these are like this one is definitely a concrete poem, right? So it's nazbas nanamas. So it's basically the zero rolling. So in our language, the verb nanamas is basically something round that is rolling, but it's not. It's lumpy on one side. It's the shape of a circle, but when it rolls, it flops around. So that's why the circle is not perfect here. And nazbas is just zero or the circle. So I hope this is making some sense a little bit. But yeah, yeah, that's what I'm working on right now are these little one-word poems. And sometimes I ask my other poet friends, like, who's gonna, I don't know who's gonna publish these. If I was living in Canada, it'd probably be easy, because those writers out there, they're always experimenting, and they have presses that publish their works, and but here in the States, there's not much, I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty sure someone will probably, I did have 2 of these published in Poetry Magazine last year, so, but that's probably because there's a new editor now, Adrian Matika, right? I think he's the new editor of Poetry Magazine now. So I think he's sort of kind of opening it up a little bit, right? So things are a little bit more open with that magazine now. So, but I was really happy that they published 2 of my one-word poems. So,
Great. Thank you, Orlando. Thank you.